The teacup slipped from my hand. A sharp, clean sound, glass against tile, echoed once, then disappeared into the quiet of the small kitchen. Porcelain shards scattered across the floor, blending with my son's words. "Mom, this house isn't yours anymore." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake. Not a single crack of emotion, just a calm, precise tone, steady, measured. Every word placed exactly where it belonged. No anger, no resentment. Only the kind of composure that takes years to perfect, as if this moment had been rehearsed, and today he was simply reading from a script he'd written long ago. "I'm only doing what's necessary, Mom, so you don't have to worry." Still gentle, still polite, impeccably logical, like someone helping a stranger pack away what no longer mattered. I said nothing. No one argues with a verdict that's already been signed. Outside, rain began to tap against the window, each drop landing with the precision of a full stop. When he left, the kitchen grew unbearably quiet. Only the clock remained, ticking slow and deliberate, as if measuring how long it would take for me to accept what had just happened. I sat down, picked up a piece of broken porcelain. Its edge cut my finger, a thin line of blood. The red spread slowly, small but vivid, proof that I was still alive. That night I packed a few things, my husband's notebook, an old wool scarf, and a key that no longer opened any door. Stepping out onto the porch, I heard the faint sound of the sea, distant, almost like someone calling my name. For the first time I didn't turn back, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left worth holding on to. In the days that followed, I rented a small apartment overlooking the ocean. I learned to breathe evenly, to eat slowly, to listen to the waves as if they were the rhythm of my own heart. Time passed. The wound didn't heal because of an apology. It healed through silence. Now, one late afternoon, the wind brushes past, salty and warm. I look toward the horizon, where the waves keep folding into themselves, steady, endless, as if they've never known what it means to part. No anger, no fear. Only the quiet breath of a woman who has finally chosen herself. If this story speaks to you, stay and listen to what comes next. And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes all it takes is one honest voice to make your heart feel at peace again. I'm 68. At the age when most people start talking to themselves, I talk to the Oregon Sea. This morning, the waves hit the rocks like an old clock, steady, patient, sometimes heavy, sometimes soft, as if the ocean itself were keeping time for me. No music could ever match that rhythm. My small wooden house sits right at the edge of the cliff, where the wind never bothers to knock. The wood has faded, the paint peels in long strips, but I love the way the floorboards creak when I walk across them, like the voice of an old friend who never stops speaking. The scent of sea salt drifts through the window, mixing with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a fragrance hard to name, both warm and lonely. I rest my hand on the wooden window frame, a gesture so old that if I forget to do it one morning, I feel hollow inside. It's a habit I've kept since my husband passed. Maybe my hand is still waiting for something familiar to return. The wind slips through my fingers, sharp and cold, but I leave my hand there, as if pulling it back would mean losing the last thread that connects me to the mornings we once shared. Outside, the sky is clear today. The sun hasn't fully risen, but the air holds a sleepy kind of light, pale gray, spreading across the water like brushed silver. Whenever that light touches the glass, I remember how he used to say, "Morning light always knows how to forgive." I never truly understood what he meant, but each time I look at the sea, I believe him a little more. I scoop coffee into a cup, pour in the hot water, and listen to the gulls somewhere in the distance. They chatter along the cliffs, perhaps discussing the new day. Their calls sound like replies to my quiet monologue. In that small moment, I don't feel lonely at all, just the slow, gentle passing of time brushing against my gray sweater. Every morning I walk the path that winds down to the beach. I don't need a clock. The waves are always on time. When I step outside, I leave behind the smell of coffee still rising and my shadow on the wall. But my steps remain steady, as if I'm walking towards someone still waiting for me. The ocean wind hits my face, salt clinging to my lips, and I breathe in deeply. There's something in that air that reminds you you're alive, not because you're happy, but because existence still has sound. The waves, the wind, and the quiet echo of someone long gone. I stop when a wave crashes against a rock, spraying a mist of silver droplets that catch the first sunlight. It looks like a shattered mirror, broken yet breathtakingly beautiful. Maybe old age is like the morning sea. It seems calm, but beneath the surface 1,000 unseen currents move. The sand glimmers under the pale sun, each grain like a tiny shard of glass. I walk along the shore, my footprints tracing a line parallel to the edge of the water. A seagull swoops down, then rises again, leaving behind a silence so pure I can hear the rhythm of my own heart. When I bend down, the light glints off something nestled between two receding waves, a cracked seashell, ivory-colored, dusted with sand. I pick it up and turn it over in my hand. The fracture runs fine and deep, like a thread pulled through time. I brush my finger across it. The roughness reminds me of wounds long healed but not forgotten. There's something about that crack that makes me linger. Maybe the heart doesn't weaken with age. It just reveals its fractures more clearly. I think of that and smile to myself. At this age, there's no need to hide the cracks anymore. Sometimes they're what make us feel most real. I slip the shell into the pocket of my wool coat and keep walking. The wind pushes against me, carrying the scent of damp pine and the sound of stronger waves, as if to remind me that the sea, too, has broken 1,000 times and still finds a way to mend. I stop at the rocky ledge where my husband once sat to fish. He used to say, "The sea never stays the same. It changes every day so it can keep on living." I learned the meaning of that too late, but now I finally understand. When I returned home, the light had changed. No longer golden, but tinted gray like an old photograph fading with time. I opened the door. The faint scent of coffee still lingered. The little house, the rocking chair, the framed picture on the wall, everything sat quietly, untouched. I thought I would go on living like this for years, brewing coffee in the morning, walking by the sea in the afternoon, reading a few pages at night before falling asleep to the sound of wind. Then the phone rang. That sound, strange, almost intrusive, echoed through the stillness like a stranger who'd wandered into a place where human voices didn't belong. I picked up slowly. A familiar voice came through, carrying the hurried breath of city life. "Mom, we're going to stay with you for a while, so you won't be lonely." I heard a soft laugh on the other end, and a woman's voice, his wife's, saying in the background, "Tell her it's just temporary, honey." I stayed silent for a few seconds. Outside the window, clouds gathered, the light shifted tone. I wanted to say something. I'm not lonely. But my throat closed up. Not from emotion, but from the quiet certainty that the peace I'd known had just come to an end. I set the phone down. The coffee was still warm. Inside my coat pocket, the cracked seashell brushed softly against my chest. A faint, whispering sound, like a breath. Or maybe the first warning of a new season's wind. That morning, a thin mist settled over the cliffs, moisture clinging to the window panes. I had just set the coffee pot on the table when the door opened. The hinges groaned, a long familiar sigh, and before I could say a word, Melissa's arms were around me. Her perfume wrapped over the smell of sea salt, sweet and foreign. Two worlds brushing against each other. "Oh, it's colder than I thought," she said, voice high and hurried, then laughed. "I miss this smell. Smells like vacation." I smiled, not sure if it was meant as a compliment or just the way city people fill silence with words. Behind her, the children rolled their suitcases across the wooden floor. The wheels thumped rhythmically, and the older boy brushed against a photo frame, my husband smiling, midway through building his first wooden boat. The frame tilted, bumping softly against the wall, like a breath caught mid-sigh. "Oops, sorry, Grandma," he said quickly, his voice a little shaky. I bent down, straightened the frame. "It's all right, dear," I said, though inside, something faint and fragile trembled. "Just a few weeks, Mom," Daniel said, smiling as if the decision had already been made. That smile, still the same one he had as a boy, only now it carried the weight of deadlines and exhaustion. I could see the city pressed between his brows, the fatigue hiding in the corners of his grin. "Just until we get things settled, okay?" he added, his tone soft, almost persuasive. I nodded, the automatic gesture of a mother. We nod first, and only later realize what we've agreed to. Melissa was busy right away, unpacking suitcases, lining up shoes, hanging coats, drawing curtains. Her rhythm pulled the whole house along with her. The light shifted as the silk curtains caught the sun, and within minutes, the scent of old coffee was gone. Daniel walked around, checking windows, flipping light switches. "The place still looks good, Mom," he said. I answered quietly. "It tries its best." He laughed, not realizing I wasn't talking about the house. Lunch was simple, clam chowder and toasted bread. Melissa added pepper, more salt, and a handful of advice about elderly nutrition. She spoke fast, her hands moving constantly, and whenever she laughed, the light caught her small earrings like flickers of glass. Daniel joined in. "Eat a little more, Mom, okay? You look thin." I stared at the bowl of soup, steam curling upward, the smell of seafood blending with her lingering perfume. It all felt too full, as if the little house had run out of air. After lunch, Melissa flipped open her laptop. "I think we can work remote from here for a few weeks," she said. "The Wi-Fi's still working, right?" I nodded again, once more. Outside, the ocean was still there. The waves still rose and fell, but their sound now felt muted, trapped behind glass. By evening, the sky had turned a dull bronze gray. I invited them to stay for dinner, the first meal this house had hosted in a long time. Melissa picked a cream-colored tablecloth. Daniel set the plates. I cooked baked cod with butter, my husband's favorite dish. The air filled with its soft, rich scent, but no one mentioned him. When everything was set on the table, the clinking of knives and spoons against plates filled the air, a cold, dry rhythm, precise as a clock. The conversation came in fragments, plans to fix the roof, replace the curtains, updates about the children's school. No one asked what I wanted. I sat there listening to them talk, feeling like a guest invited into my own home. "Mom," Daniel said, "I might call the plumber next week. The sink's dripping again." "It's been dripping for 2 years," I murmured. He nodded, eyes shifting away, as if this kitchen were already waiting for someone else to take charge. After dinner, Melissa brought out a second coffee machine, sleek, polished, with its cord neatly wound. You'll love the convenience, she said brightly, as though presenting me with a bouquet. Your old one's kind of vintage, but I think this one's faster. She set it right beside my old machine, the one I've used every morning, the one my husband patched with silver tape when the nozzle leaked. 2 generations of coffee makers now stood side by side, like 2 ways of living, one gleaming, one patient. I thought about saying, "Thank you, but I still prefer the old one," and then decided not to. Because when people bring you something they believe is better, they rarely care to hear that you'd rather keep what's worn but familiar. That night, the house was brighter than usual. More lights, more voices, and the steady tapping of a keyboard from the living room. But inside me, something dimmed. A quiet flame snuffed out beneath the glow of LED bulbs. I said nothing, just cleared the dishes, washed each plate slowly. As the water ran over my hands, I thought of the cracked seashell still tucked in my coat pocket. I took it out, dried it gently, and placed it on the shelf by the window, where moonlight caught the dry grains of sand still clinging to its surface. It looked small and slightly lost among the polished, modern things, but it was mine, like a fragment of memory I wasn't ready to throw away. There must be a place for fragility, and that night I knew. The house would never be quiet again, but at least, somewhere within it, a small corner still breathed in its own rhythm. The morning smelled of fresh paint. That faint, chemical sharpness mingled with the sea breeze, making my head spin a little. I stepped into the studio, the room where I used to spend hours sitting in silence among colors. Now the canvases leaned against the wall, the paint still drying, brushes left damp and waiting. Melissa stood in the middle of the room, holding an interior layout on her iPad. "I was thinking," she said, "we could turn this into a playroom for the kids. What do you think?" I looked around. The easel, the jars of pigment, an unfinished canvas propped against the corner. Everything seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for me to defend it. "The kids need a creative space," she continued, "and you can still paint if you want, maybe in the kitchen corner. There's good light there." I nodded, the kind of polite smile people wear when they don't want to stir the water. "Sure," I said softly. "It's just paint, after all." But inside, it felt like someone had opened all the windows in winter. Daniel came in then, coffee cup in hand. He caught the tail end of my sentence and set his mug down. "Mom, Melissa's right," he said. "You're getting older. Let us handle the big stuff. You just relax, enjoy life a little." His tone was calm, gentle, as if he were suggesting a new light bulb, not rearranging the last piece of my world. I looked at my son, the same boy who once ran around this room, his hands covered in watercolor, laughing. Now he spoke about big stuff while quietly pushing me out of the only corner I had left. I smiled, that practiced, diplomatic smile I've worn through years of being a wife, a mother, a peacekeeper. But in my pocket, my fingers closed tightly around the studio key, so tight that the cold metal left marks in my palm. Daniel didn't notice. He was too busy listing plans. "We could repaint, maybe add shelves, a rug. The kids will love it." I nodded in rhythm with his words, but all I could hear was the ocean outside, its sound thinning, fading, muted behind invisible walls. After he left, I sat in the old chair by the window, where sunlight still slipped through the blinds like threads of gold. On the table, a streak of ultramarine blue I'd forgotten to wipe off yesterday had dried unevenly. I touched it. The faint smudge spread across my fingertip. That small sensation reminded me I was still real, if only for a moment. Outside, Melissa called, "Lunch is ready." I answered, "Coming," my voice echoing through the half-new, half-old room, like a faint reflection of someone I used to be. By late afternoon, the sun drifted past the studio window, leaving one pale band of light across the wall, the last trace of the day. I sat there, fingers still wrapped around the ring of keys in my pocket. Being loved is not the same as being arranged. Both can feel warm, but in very different ways. Love makes you feel seen. Arrangement asks you to shrink until you fit the shape someone else has drawn. I used to think that when my children moved back in, the house would feel alive again. But joy never truly stays. It only visits, like light slipping through the curtains. Enough to remember, never enough to warm. At dinner, Melissa set the table beautifully. Vanilla-scented candles, napkins folded into little swans. Daniel talked about next month's budget, plans to fix the porch roof, and the moving truck schedule. They spoke in the voices of people steering a great family ship. Only they forgot that I was still sitting on board. No one asked, "What do you think, Mom?" I sipped my wine, listening to the sound of knives on plates, children's laughter, Melissa reading through her shopping list. Every sound was familiar, yet I felt detached, as if I were overhearing someone else's life playing softly from a forgotten radio. Daniel looked up briefly. "Mom, you okay?" I smiled. "I'm fine." He nodded, relieved, and turned back to his laptop. No one asked again, because in America, "I'm fine" is how a conversation ends. Sometimes, though, it's also a slow kind of goodbye. When the house sank into night, the wind from the sea slipped through the cracks in the door, carrying the chill of salt. I sat in the dark, my tea gone cold on the table. Moonlight glowed on the cracked seashell I'd left on the shelf, the only thing still shimmering faintly. I picked it up and held it to my ear. Inside, the wind sounded like a shallow breath, soft, uneven, like a small creature struggling to stay alive. Maybe it was the sound of the sea, or maybe it was me, after a whole day spent holding myself together. I closed my eyes. Outside, the waves still rolled, but thinner now, fainter. And in that fading sound, something inside me began to crack. Not the shell, but the quiet I had tried so hard to keep. The morning was so quiet I could hear the scratch of Chloe's pencil against the wooden floor. Light streamed through the window, spilling across the kitchen table where Daniel sat flipping through mortgage papers. Thick, white sheets stamped with the sharp, cold logo of a bank. Beside him, Melissa was taking notes, writing refinance options in neat, square handwriting, dividing everything into boxes like she was preparing for a presentation. I stood at the kitchen doorway before they noticed me. It felt like watching someone rearrange the drawers of your memories without asking. Each rustle of paper sounded like small, measured waves, steady, deliberate, carrying something unspoken beneath. Daniel leaned forward, voice low and even. "If we time it right, we could refinance at a lower rate. The equity's solid. Mom could co-sign temporarily, and I'll handle the loan part." Melissa nodded, eyes still on the documents. "That's smart. It'll help her with taxes, too." Her tone was light, confident, the kind that understands numbers better than feelings. I stepped forward. The floor creaked softly beneath me. They both closed the folder, slow and synchronized, like a door shutting on a half-heard truth. Melissa smiled, a little too bright. "Oh, hi, Mom. We were just looking at a few papers, nothing serious." I didn't ask at first. Then I pulled out a chair and sat down. "What kind of papers?" Daniel exhaled, fingers tapping the table's edge. "Just some mortgage stuff, Mom. We could save a bit if we refinance. You'd just need to sign temporarily so I can handle the loan, less for you to worry about. I looked at my son, the man who once asked me to co-sign his college loan at 18. The same boy who once promised, "I'll never let you worry." Now he said, "Let me take care of it," with the same tone, but a different meaning altogether. Morning light fell across the table, glinting off the edge of the paper, thin and sharp as a blade. I didn't hate their intentions, but a chill slid quietly into my chest. Love, sometimes, takes the shape of a contract. You sign it out of trust, never quite sure what part of yourself you're giving away. I lifted my coffee cup. The bitterness spread through my mouth, a kind of wakefulness that almost stung. Daniel spoke again, gently. "I know you get anxious with paperwork, but this would make things easier if you just let us handle it. You'd only need to sign." I set the cup down. The soft clink of porcelain against wood sounded like a quiet no that didn't need words. I stood and said, "I'll look it over, there's no rush." Melissa smiled, polite but tight. "Sure, take your time." But I knew the time she spoke of wasn't mine. It belonged to a plan already written long ago. I turned and walked toward the back porch. The door closed behind me with a slow, heavy thud, that sound that always feels like something final. Standing on the porch, the wind brushed salt against my face. I looked down at my hands, dry, trembling slightly. They shook not from fear, but from the quiet ache of being disregarded. It wasn't the first time they'd done it, but this time, my silence made me feel nearly invisible. Inside, their voices carried faintly through the door, drifting into fragments. Paperwork, better rate, safety. They spoke the language of grown-ups, polite, efficient, and heartbreakingly far from the language of the heart. They believe they're saving me. They believe they're doing what's best. But every time they say, "So you won't have to worry," it feels like another wave rolling over me. Soft, steady, slowly blurring the outline of who I used to be. And suddenly, I've become a broken boat, no longer allowed to sail, only kept ashore, preserved for safety. I remember the days after my husband died, when I'd still take the small rowboat out past the bay, just to hear the sound of wood cutting through water. No one believed I would dare, but I did, because staying home meant listening to the hollow echo inside my chest. Now no one forbids me from going. They simply wrap me in a gentleness so tight I can't breathe through it. I stepped down the wooden stairs. The wind hits stronger here. The sea ahead is gray-blue, its waves crashing against the cliffs, throwing up white foam. Perhaps the ocean, too, has grown weary of human love, that kind of love that always wants to fix it into calm. I reach into my coat pocket and take out the cracked seashell. The midday light strikes the fracture, splitting it into two sharp shades, light and shadow. I turn it in my palm, feel the edge press lightly against my skin. Then I set it down on the porch, beside the worn wooden step where he once sat mending his nets. The wind rushes through, carrying the sound of waves breaking on the rocks, a deep, guttural voice, almost like the sea itself growling, "Enough." I can't tell where that sound came from, the ocean, my own chest, or from the small cracks spreading quietly through the silence, but it was real, and it was heavy. I looked up, the sky dimming above the horizon, and turned back toward the house. My shadow stretched long across the floorboards, slow, deliberate, the shadow of someone who has begun to change, not to fight, but simply to stop disappearing. The morning sun was pale, thin as silk. I pulled on a light sweater and walked down the narrow road leading to the coastal town. The air carried the scent of salt and damp wood, and it reminded me of the days when I used to teach music. Mornings spent climbing this same hill, a folder of sheet music in my arms, humming the melody of the sea. Today, I was meeting Irene at the small cafe by the harbor. The bell chimed as I opened the door. Inside, the smell of fresh waffles mingled with roasted coffee beans. I chose a table by the window, where sunlight shimmered on the water, and waited. Irene arrived, her silver hair neatly pinned, her frame thin but steady, eyes bright with the kind of clarity that only comes from having weathered too many storms. She hugged me lightly, and the scent of lavender soap lingered on my shoulder. "Your house still the same?" she asked, pouring herself coffee. "Yes," I said, "just fuller." She smiled, a narrow, dry smile, like a February wind. "I understand." She told me she once gave her house to her daughter, though gave wasn't quite the right word. She'd been convinced it would be easier for everyone. She said I could stay at her place for a few months, Irene said, stirring her coffee absently. Then those months became 5 years. By the time I noticed, all my husband's photos were gone. Her voice was calm, neither bitter nor angry, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from losing your right to speak so long ago you forget you ever had it. I looked at her hands, thin, speckled with age spots, so much like mine. And in that moment, I saw myself reflected in her. A future version of me, sitting in a stranger's home, missing a place that no longer bore my name. Then she looked up, her gaze sharp, unwavering. "Silence is a form of consent," she said, her cool fingers closing around mine. I didn't respond right away. The words were simple, yet they landed where my heartbeat lived. I had stayed silent for too long, believing that was the gentlest way to love. But sitting across from Irene, I realized there are silences that slowly erase you from the family portrait. She went on, her tone steady and clear. "If you don't speak, they'll take your quiet as agreement, and one day you won't be asked what you think at all." I nodded softly. The smell of waffles spread through the cafe, warm, sweet, but all I could taste was the flavor of something about to change, though I couldn't yet name it. Outside the window, the wind brushed across the harbor, and the sound of a mooring rope rubbed against a hull, a long, aching creak. It reminded me of the cracked seashell on my porch, the sound of endurance, but maybe, at last, the moment before it learned to cry out. After Irene left, I stayed behind. My coffee had gone cold, its surface dark and still as the late afternoon sea. I watched her disappear down the street, her pale lilac scarf trailing behind, the color of someone who's accepted too much for too long. I saw her as a mirror delayed, the future I'd meet if I didn't speak. In the window's reflection, I saw myself, a 68-year-old woman, shoulders slightly curved, eyes kind but dulled, a face that had memorized the art of smiling and enduring. The clink of a spoon against porcelain startled me. At the next table, an elderly couple shared a piece of cake. They barely spoke, yet their silence held an ease, a quiet companionship. And I finally understood. Silence isn't always weakness. You just have to know for whom you keep it. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my husband's old cloth-bound notebook, the one filled with half-finished melodies. The pages had yellowed, but the faint scent of ink remained. I turned to a blank page and wrote, in small, steady letters, "Tomorrow I will say no." The word no leaned slightly to the right, the ink darker and thicker than the rest, as if I needed to remind myself that this time I wouldn't step back. I closed the notebook and laid my hand on its cloth cover. The rough texture felt like his hand, warm but firm. If he were here, I think he'd smile and say, "It's about time, Ellie." Outside, the wind pressed against my face, cold but clarifying. The sunset spilled sideways over the water, dividing the sky in two, half amber, half gray-violet. I walked slowly along the shore, the breeze carrying the faint sweetness of waffles still clinging to my hair. In my coat pocket, my fingers brushed the cracked seashell, cold now, but when the light caught it, its fracture split the sunset in two. I stopped and looked closely. Sometimes, just a single crack is enough to separate light from shadow. But because of it, you finally see where you end and where the world begins. I slipped the shell back into my pocket and took a deep breath. The waves crashed against the rocks, steady, strong. Somewhere in the wind, a voice seemed to whisper, "Speak." Tomorrow, I will. The morning was misty, the kind of pale light that poured through the kitchen window and spread across the wooden floor like a soft blanket. I was pouring coffee when I heard light footsteps in the hallway. The door creaked open, and Melissa's voice followed. "I'm going to clear out the studio for the kids, okay?" Her tone was gentle, friendly, the kind that sounds harmless. But beneath it, I could already hear the scent of new paint, the pastel rugs, the toys that would soon replace the smell of oil paint and the whisper of brushes on canvas. I looked up. The morning light fell through the curtain, touching Melissa's face. Young, confident, so certain she was doing the right thing. I looked around the kitchen. The cups I once arranged, now rearranged, the drawers labeled neatly, the second coffee machine shining beside the old one. My house was beginning to speak someone else's language. I set my cup down, my palm still warm from it. Then I met her gaze and said, calmly, without a tremor, "No, that's where I breathe." The sound was short, clean, like a string cut free from a knot. No explanation needed. At that moment, I heard the wind outside, quiet but clear, as if it too stood beside me. Melissa froze. Her eyes blinked quickly, not surprised, just unaccustomed to a voice that didn't ask for permission. "Oh, okay," she said softly. "I just thought—" "I know what you thought," I said, cutting in. But no. In that kitchen, a space opened, a narrow stretch of silence between two women, one learning to step back, the other learning to stand tall. The silence was heavy, like a wet blanket laid over the air. Daniel walked in, coffee mug in hand. He glanced around, felt the tension, and tried to smooth it away with a smile. "Hey, what's going on here?" "Nothing," Melissa said quickly. "I just asked Mom about the studio." Daniel nodded, then turned to me. "Don't make this a big deal, Mom. It's just a room." His voice was calm, gentle, the kind of tone you use when you're too tired to argue with a child. But my eyes stayed steady. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I just smiled faintly and turned back to the coffee pot. Outside, the sea brushed against the cliffs, soft, rhythmic, steady as breathing. I inhaled deeply, hearing that one word, "No," still echoing in my chest like the first note in a song I'd been silent about for too long. Daniel stood there, still holding his mug, his coffee untouched. I looked at him, the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, now trying to look calm under his mother's gaze. I met his eyes. "I'm not overreacting," I said quietly. "I'm just being clear." The air seemed to freeze. My voice was calm, but firm enough to fill the whole kitchen. The morning light caught the edge of the table, reflected across Daniel's face. He faltered, his mouth opening and closing, no words left to hold on to. Something inside me lifted then, a weight I'd carried in my chest for years. For the first time, my voice didn't shake, not because I wanted to win, but because I no longer wanted to lose myself. I heard it, the sound of my own voice, like the sea speaking plainly, not loud, not seeking proof, just steady and sure against the sand. Daniel's eyes softened, the kind of look that didn't know whether to be sorry or angry. He swallowed his reply, like someone trying to force down something too dry to speak through. "All right, Mom," he said quietly. "We'll leave it." Melissa set down the dish towel. The fabric slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the table. She lowered her gaze. No one spoke. Only the small sound of a spoon tapping against a cup. A quiet click, like the latch closing on an old habit. I poured more coffee. The smell of roasted beans spread through the room. No one drank it, but the warmth filled the air that had just been stretched thin. My breath slowed. My shoulders eased. The tightness in my chest loosened. Outside, the sea began to brighten. Waves shimmered in the morning light. Sunlight cut through the kitchen window, dividing the room in two. One side old, one side new. I stood between them, listening to the waves, the scent of coffee mingling with salt air. For the first time, I felt fully present, truly here in my own home. That morning, I went to the bank. The Oregon sky was a soft, dim gray, and the rain fell lightly, more like breath than water. Inside, the scent of polished wood and coffee blended together, and the rhythmic hum of a money counter beat like someone else's heart. I sat at the signing table, my arms slightly unsteady, but firm enough. I opened a new account. My signature came out steady, the M looping wide, like a wave curling to shore. The stroke felt strangely familiar, as if I'd been waiting my whole life to write it with the right rhythm. "Everything looks good, Mrs. Hayes," the young teller said with a practiced smile. I nodded. "Thank you." The feeling wasn't joy. It was quieter than that. It was like standing in the wind and realizing you no longer need anyone to pull your coat closed for you. Leaving the bank, I drove slowly along the Bay Road. The rain had stopped. Droplets clung to the windshield, glistening like grains of salt. The radio played softly, Debussy's Clair de Lune. I listened, remembering the years when my fingers played that very piece before a classroom of 12-year-olds, back when my voice was sure and my heart wasn't tired. A sign flashed on a roadside screen. "Open House, Westview Apartments, 2 miles ahead." The thought came as lightly as a breeze. "I'll just take a look," I told myself, but my heart already knew better. The apartment was on the 2nd floor, its west-facing windows catching the afternoon sun. Light filtered through linen curtains, laying soft, golden stripes across the wooden floor. The space was small, but bright, clean, and still. No children's chatter, no perfume hanging in the air, no keyboard clicking late into the night. Only the sound of wind and the clock ticking somewhere unseen. The real estate agent turned out to be a former student of mine, now nearly 40. Her eyes widened when she saw me. "Mrs. Hayes? God, it's been ages. Are you still painting?" I smiled, resting my hand on the window frame, the paint cool and smooth beneath my fingers. "I'm about to start again." I said it slowly, less an answer than a promise. She smiled and nodded, then let me wander the apartment on my own. I ran my hand along the counter, the wall, the mirror in the small bathroom. Nothing was perfect, but every corner could breathe. "Would you like me to hold the application for you?" she asked. I looked out the window. Sunlight spilled across the bay, glittering like 1,000 tiny shells. I didn't say yes, not out loud, but inside, the decision had already settled quietly, like a tide pulling back with purpose. When I left the apartment, I walked a long way down the street toward the sea. Low buildings lined the road, the wind sliding over the roofs, the scent of salt clinging to my hair. I didn't feel nervous, only calm, as if someone had touched my shoulder gently and whispered, Now you can breathe. I knew what I was doing. And more than that, I knew this wasn't revenge. It was simply the choice not to abandon myself. All these years I've lived by doing things for someone. For my husband, for my children, for the quiet belief that a good mother doesn't get tired. But this morning, as light passed through the linen curtains, I finally understood. Love isn't about staying in the place where you're slowly fading. When I got home, Daniel and Melissa were still out. I made myself a cup of tea, sat at the dining table and looked out the window. The sea beyond was a cold blue, the wind pressing against the glass in steady bursts. The house was so silent, I could hear the clock ticking, each second crisp and alive. I took out the folder I'd signed earlier, bank papers, lease copies, and slipped them all into my husband's old envelope, as if he were coming with me. The envelope was worn, deep brown with a folded corner. Across the front, his handwriting still read, "To Ellie, in case you forget where home is." I traced the letters with my fingertip, my hand trembling. "I didn't forget," I whispered. "I just stopped belonging there for a while." Outside, dusk thickened. The hallway light spilled across the wall, dividing the room into halves, light and shadow. I stood up, drew the curtains closed, as if to end a chapter that no longer needed a loud goodbye. That night, I packed a small leather bag, a few essentials, my sketchbook, a pen, a wool scarf, and the envelope. Then I opened the drawer where the cracked seashell had rested since the day the sea roared. I picked it up and held it in my palm. The lamplight passed through its fracture, splitting it into two shades, bright and dim. And I knew then, I hadn't kept it to remember pain, but to remember the part of me that once allowed herself to be fragile. I placed the shell in my bag beside the envelope. They touched lightly, a soft sound, like two pieces of memory agreeing to leave together. Before turning off the light, I stood still in the dark for a while. The sound of waves reached me from afar, slow, steady, like the heartbeat of someone beginning to heal. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow.
Evening spilled across the porch, and the wind moved through the linen curtains. I poured tea, listening to the sound of water touching porcelain, and then to the gentle flap of fabric against the window frame, a slow, steady rhythm, like a quiet warning. In the living room, the family was discussing the moving truck. Daniel's laptop glowed open. Melissa held her planner. Their voices blended with the wind, soft and constant, like waves murmuring inside the house itself.
"Saturday. They'll come an hour earlier," Daniel said, eyes still on the screen. "We'll get everything done before noon."
Melissa nodded, drawing a long line across her checklist. Toys, boxes, kitchen. I sat at the table, the warm cup of ginger tea between my hands, its scent rising like faint memory. They talked about unpacking, rearranging furniture, organizing the rooms. No one asked what I thought. This house, once a place where every object held its own memory, had become a logistics chart, sectioned, labeled, timed, and efficient. Daniel looked up and smiled.
"It's just temporary, Mom."
I nodded, but inside it felt as if someone had quietly moved the ground beneath my feet. On his screen, I caught a glimpse of the subject line, change of mailing address. His finger hovered, then clicked send. The blinking cursor vanished. I didn't say a word. Sometimes temporary is just a polite word for permanent. From the kitchen, Melissa called out cheerfully, "I just want you to feel less lonely, Mom." I turned. She was setting an alarm on a small digital clock by the oven. The beeping echoed. Beep,
Beep, beep. 6 a.m. every day. We'll start early. Be healthy, she said, smiling like a teacher praising a sleepy student. I looked at the clock sitting next to my husband's old tea tin. 2 small objects. 2 habits from different worlds. One meant to soothe, the other to control. The children laughed around the stack of boxes, their bright voices filling the air. But somehow, it didn't make the house feel any more alive. Among their chatter, I felt myself fade from the frame, like an old brushstroke covered by a new layer of paint. Melissa said something about a shopping list. Daniel nodded, and both bent over their plans. I watched them, and my heart felt strangely light, like someone about to step out of their own dream. I set my teacup down. Outside, the curtain brushed the window again. I heard it, and I knew the wind was shifting. By nightfall, the house glowed with light. Melissa folded blankets. Daniel checked the schedule one last time. Everything was arranged so perfectly that there was no space left for silence. I sat at the table corner, my tea now cold, watching my reflection ripple across its surface. Loneliness, I realized, isn't being alone. It's disappearing in the sound of people who love you. It isn't the absence of company, but the presence of so many voices that your own can no longer reach anyone. I listened to them talking, saw their mouths curve into laughter, and understood. I had long been someone to be spoken of, not spoken to. I rose and went to my room. It was unchanged, the smell of salt, of paint, and the half-finished canvas waiting on the easel. I turned on the desk lamp and opened my husband's old cloth-bound notebook. The light fell across the faded handwriting, the pages worn soft like skin. I picked up a pen and wrote a single line. If the sea is advice, then tomorrow is the answer. The words came steady, without tremor. When I finished, I closed the book gently. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that I would walk into it without asking for permission. Outside, the wind shifted. The curtains swelled and sighed, a quiet rhythm, almost like breathing. I went to the wooden shelf where the cracked seashell still rested under the low amber light. I picked it up, cupping it in both hands. Its fracture caught the glow, sharp, cold, but no longer frightening. I pressed it to my lips. The salt tasted faint, familiar. The crack was cool, but it didn't draw blood anymore. It only reminded me that some things can still be beautiful, even after they've been broken. I set the seashell back on the windowsill, where a thin thread of moonlight had just begun to touch it. Outside, the sea lay dark and heavy, its waves exhaling like tired breath. I stood there for a long time, until the wind brushed the collar of my sweater, carrying with it the scent of a day on the edge of ending. Tomorrow, the moving truck will come. But tonight, the silence, how to keep it, why to keep it, still belongs to me. The morning was a dull gray, fog so thick it blurred the sea until it looked like glass fogged by breath. I sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, listening to the unfamiliar sounds outside. An engine starting, voices calling, the crunch of tires grinding gravel. A sound that felt like something inevitable being dragged into place. I stood. Through the window I saw the white truck parked at the end of the drive. Men in reflective vests lowered the ramp, metal chains clattering together. Daniel stood in front, directing them. Everything already arranged, everything ready, except for one missing signature. Mine. Melissa held a clipboard, coat buttoned to her throat, her voice rising in the wind. Let's start with the living room first. I stepped onto the porch. The wind cut at my collar, my hair whipped loose. The morning light was cold and metallic, glistening on the door handle. My hand gripped it tight, my palm grew damp. Daniel turned toward me, his voice calm, tired. "Mom, open the door. They'll unload. It won't take long." He spoke like a man at work, no trace of the boy who once held my hand when thunder scared him. I met his eyes and said quietly but firmly, "No one comes in." The words dropped hard and clear enough for everyone in the yard to hear. For a moment, time stopped. The wind stilled. Even the waves beneath the cliff seemed to hold their breath. The sentence fell across the porch like a stone breaking the surface of still water. Seagulls startled, bursting upward, their white wings slicing through the gray fog. I watched them, feeling suddenly lighter, as if they were carrying away something I no longer needed to hold. Daniel froze, his hand still resting on the truck's door handle. Wind moved between us, stretching the silence taut. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm keeping my home," I said, steady as someone reading the weather. I could hear my own heartbeat, not fast, not slow, just stronger than everything else. Melissa stepped forward, her hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Maybe she needs more time," she whispered. Daniel looked at me, his eyes torn between pity and frustration. His lips parted, then closed again, like waves trying to speak before breaking into silence. I didn't say another word. Everything that needed saying had already been said. Offshore, the wind began to rise, bringing the smell of salt and rain. Far out, the ocean stirred, waves swelling, the storm that had been building for days finally taking shape. And it wasn't only out there. It was here, too, in this house, in this moment. The wind hit harder, carrying the first scent of the storm. The movers hesitated, looking to one another for direction. Daniel still said nothing, and Melissa stepped closer, her eyes glassy. "Mom, how could you?" she asked softly, her voice breaking. I met her gaze, then said slowly, "I could, because I chose myself." The words left my mouth small but sure, and for a heartbeat everything went still. Somewhere over the water thunder rolled, low, deep, like an answer from the earth itself. Melissa covered her mouth, tears spilled over. Daniel turned away, his shoulders tightening. He didn't yell. He just took a deep breath, the kind of breath a man takes when trying to keep his boat from capsizing mid-storm. I walked back inside and picked up the landline. My hand was steady. I dialed the number printed on the moving form. "Hello?" I said evenly. "This job doesn't have the homeowner's consent." A pause on the other end, then a voice. "Yes, ma'am. We'll cancel the order right away." I hung up and exhaled. The sound of that breath echoed through the kitchen like a clean, final note. When I turned, Daniel was standing in the doorway, his face uncertain, not sure whether to be angry or relieved. "You don't have to understand me today," I said softly. "Just remember, I once understood you this way, too." Outside, rain began to fall. Heavy, cold, relentless. The wind tore across the porch, rattling the curtains, making the picture frame on the wall tremble. In my coat pocket, the cracked seashell rubbed lightly against itself, a faint tick, 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 small but distinct. Not a sound of complaint, but of approval. I closed my fingers around it, feeling its chill against my palm. It wasn't a symbol of pain anymore, but a heartbeat, proof that courage still lived there. The wind surged and the sea roared beyond the cliffs. Out over the black horizon, the gulls had returned, wings bright against the storm-dark sky. They didn't fear the storm. They only needed a direction to fly. And for the first time, so did I.
That morning, fog still covered the road leading into town. I drove slowly, the radio playing softly. River flows in you. The melody, familiar and tender, filled the car with a strange kind of calm. The storm had passed during the night, leaving streaks of water glistening across the windshield, reflecting the pale silver sky. The small red brick bank sat at the corner of Main Street, its slanted roof wet from the rain. When I walked in, my shoes made a soft sound on the floor. The receptionist recognized me and smiled. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes." I nodded, tightening my grip on the leather bag. Inside were the transfer documents, the new lease agreement, and one small thing I'd carried for years: the fountain pen that once belonged to my husband. When I sat down, the advisor placed a thick folder on the desk. Her tone was friendly, practiced, mechanical. "Just review the last page and sign when you're ready." I turned each page slowly. Black ink, numbers, clauses. Everything clear, precise, leaving no room for hesitation. When the pen touched paper, the ink flowed smooth as water. My hand felt lighter with each curve of my name. It wasn't joy I felt, but a quiet release, like finally letting go of a stone you've been holding so long you forgot your hand was tired. The advisor looked up and asked gently, "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said, steady, with only one slow breath. The sound of my voice filled the small room, clearer than the click of the pen falling back to the table. When it was done, the receptionist handed me a white envelope, the one meant for the house keys. I reached into my coat pocket and took out a colored pencil, a leftover from the children's art box Melissa had bought long ago. On the envelope, I wrote a single word: "Thanks." No name, no signature, just that. I slipped the old house key inside, hearing the faint clink of metal against paper, soft and final. Before leaving, I looked around the office one last time. Everything was neat, orderly, untouched, as if no one had ever come here to begin a new life. I pocketed the pen, my husband's pen, and stood. The papers were done. The road ahead, however narrow, was mine alone. When I stepped outside, the morning wind brushed against my face, carrying the damp scent of rain. In my bag, the cracked seashell clicked softly, a small sound, but enough to make me smile. Maybe it, too, knew we were leaving shore. I walked to the parking lot, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The sun had begun to rise, its light catching the puddles along the road. When I reached for the car door, I turned once, not toward the house I had left behind, but toward its image in my mind. I could still see the porch railing worn smooth by his hands, the spot where he used to stand each morning watching the sea. The faded paint, the scratched wood, each mark carried the memory of two people who once believed everything would last. I don't know if Daniel or Melissa will ever notice that some things can't be refinished. They can only be remembered. A light wind moved through that memory, stirring the curtain that still hung in my thoughts. I closed my eyes, and there he was, holding his coffee cup, smiling softly. "Go on, Ellie," he said. "You've waited long enough." I smiled back, just a little. You don't betray memory by moving forward. That's what I thought, and for the first time, I believed it. Memory isn't a chain that keeps us in place. It's the light that falls ahead of us, so we don't stumble twice on the same path. I opened the car door and set my bag on the passenger seat. Inside, the envelope with the key and the cracked seashell rested side by side. 2 notes, one low, one bright, together forming their own quiet harmony. I drew a long breath, feeling my chest open, no longer tight, but wide, ready. Then I drove. The road curved downhill toward the sea, winding through the hills. Sunlight filtered through the pines, scattering across the windshield, bright as tears recently wiped away, not yet dry, but clear. I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence fill the car, steady, alive. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller, then disappeared behind the trees, but I didn't look back. Every journey needs one drive where you don't promise to return. The wind slipped through the open window, cool and faintly salty. I thought of the west-facing apartment, the linen curtains, the empty easel, waiting. One day, I'll hang a new painting there, not to start over, but simply to keep living. The first afternoon in my new apartment, I pulled every curtain open and let the light flood in. The place was small, but the sunlight stretched across the wooden floor like a ribbon of gold. It slipped into every corner, brushed the edge of a chair, glided over the old bookshelf I brought with me, and rested on the oak table by the window. The room was so still I could hear the wind move through the cracks, could hear my own breath shifting pace. No children running, no 6 a.m. alarms, no voices cutting through morning coffee. Only mine, the sound of my footsteps on the floor, the kettle beginning to sing, and one steady heartbeat. I didn't feel empty. I felt light. I opened the last box, pulled out a large canvas still wrapped in brown cloth. When I peeled it back, the familiar scent of old oil paint rose, like a friend finally come home. I hung the painting Sea Within on the wall. Deep ultramarine waves brushed against a quiet horizon, and in the afternoon light, the sea inside the frame seemed to move. I painted it years ago, in a winter of silence. Back then, I didn't know why I named it that. Now I do. Each of us carries a sea within. Some days calm, some days raging, but always there, no matter who tries to quiet it. I stepped back, watching the light slant across the frame. The white wall seemed to breathe. I didn't need anything more. No large cabinet, no chandelier. Just one painting, one chair, and space enough for the light to travel through. When night began to fall, I poured myself a small glass of wine and opened my old playlist. That evening, I chose James Taylor. His voice, husky, warm, felt like someone telling a story to themselves. You've Got a Friend floated through the room, slow and low. I sank into the linen sofa that curved softly around my back. The fabric was cool. The chill of evening brushed against my skin. I closed my eyes, let the music move around me, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of silence. Here, silence wasn't punishment, it was return. Under the soft yellow light I looked around. The small apartment, the pale wood floor, the painting of the sea, the teacup, the reading lamp. Not much, but enough. Perhaps happiness, after all, is simply a room where you don't need anyone's permission to open the window. By the time night deepened, the city lights outside began to shimmer. I sat by the window, watching the glowing rectangles of distant buildings. Their reflections trembled in my wineglass, like a small flame refusing to go out. Maybe someone looking in from the street would think I was lonely. But the truth was, I'd never felt more with myself than in that moment. It wasn't that I left my family. I just stepped out of the role someone else had written for me. For years I had lived inside other people's stories, the considerate mother, the gentle wife, the grateful elder. But when the role ended, I realized I was still here, whole, just unread, waiting for the next chapter. I didn't need to erase the past. I only needed to hold the pen again. The next morning I woke early. The sunlight from the west the day before now bounced off the opposite wall, painting the ceiling in the color of honey. I cleared a small space near the window, set up a wooden table, an easel, and hung a sign by the door. Art class, for women who forgot they were artists. The first student to arrive was Mrs. Rose, 70 years old, her hands trembling as she held the brush. "I've never painted," she said softly. "I only ever lived for others." I smiled, handed her a tube of paint, and said slowly, "Hold the brush like you'd hold yourself. Don't fear a wrong stroke, just be honest with your hand." More women came. A widow, a retired accountant, a housewife who'd once dreamed of color. They sat around the table, the radio playing low in the background, and let the silence warm the room. In each hesitant line they painted, I saw myself, years once erased, now rewritten in color. By late afternoon, when they had gone, the room still smelled of paint and faint laughter. I cleaned the brushes, rinsed my hands under warm water, and felt the pigment lingering on my skin, a gentle reminder that some marks aren't meant to be washed away. On the windowsill, the cracked seashell rested quietly. The last light of the day caught its fracture, casting a thin, bright line on the wall. Now it was just a keepsake, not an excuse, not for pity, not for longing, only to remind me that a crack isn't the end, but the way light finds its path through. I poured more tea, sat by the window, and looked out. The sea was only a faint blur in the distance, but in my mind I could still hear the waves, steady, alive. This little apartment, for me, wasn't a hiding place. It was proof that a life can begin again at nearly 70, with nothing more than a west-facing window and one old seashell. The morning was colder than usual. A thin light slid through the linen curtains, dividing the room into halves, gray and pale gold. I was making coffee when I heard the knock. 3 times, firm. Not the kind of knock from a neighbor or a mail carrier. I opened the door. A middle-aged man stood there. Dark suit, polished shoes, hair combed smooth, expression polite enough to feel empty. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a cream envelope, and said in a rehearsed, even tone, "I'm Daniel's attorney. My client believes you're emotionally unstable." The words moved through the air like a knife wrapped in velvet. I took the envelope, nodded once. I see. No need to ask questions. I knew Daniel. He wasn't cruel, just afraid. Afraid and convinced that control was the same as care. I didn't blame him, but that didn't make me any less real. The man turned and left. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, measured and final. When the door closed, a cool emptiness spread through the apartment. I sat at the table, opened the envelope. White paper, black ink. Legal language so precise it no longer felt human. The phrase emotionally unstable appeared twice. I smiled, not bitterly, not sadly, just a small, steady smile. I opened my laptop, scanned copies of every document, bank records, lease agreement, tax forms, a photo of the new studio. Then I added one more image, a photograph of the cracked seashell on my windowsill, light shining clean through the fracture like a thin vein of life. At the end of the email, I wrote, "The crack doesn't make it less of a shell. It only shows where the light has passed through." Then I hit send. No anger attached, no defense needed. Just a truth spoken without the need to shout. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I lifted it, breathed in the faint scent, bitterness turning soft, the way freedom sometimes smells before it rains. I leaned back, looked out the window. The sky was gray, but not heavy. Clouds drifted slowly, as if even they needed time to change shape. I thought about the word they'd used, unstable, and I laughed quietly. I have been weak, yes, but never incapable of loving myself. Weakness, I realized, isn't the enemy. It's simply the breath courage takes before learning to stand again. I set the cup down. Afternoon light slanted across the table, catching on a paintbrush still tipped with ocean blue from yesterday's class. The dried paint had formed a tiny wave. In it, I saw my reflection, not stretched long by fear anymore, but by the return of light. The day moved slowly. Outside the window, the light softened, covering the room in a faded gold, like worn fabric. The laptop stayed open. No reply in the inbox.
The phone remained still. No buzz, no call, no message from Daniel. Only the wind, carrying the faint scent of linseed oil and wood. Freedom with a trace of loneliness. I stood and walked toward the kitchen. The last light of day glowed against the wall, reflected off the kettle just beginning to boil. I took out the tin of orange blossom tea, the kind my husband used to love in winter. As the water turned the color of pale honey, I poured 2 cups, one for me and one left empty across the table. No one sat there, but in the steam rising between them, I saw his outline. Dark sweater, hands cupped around porcelain, that slow, knowing smile. Softly, afraid to break the air, I whispered, "You see, love? I'm learning to breathe again." My voice trembled, not with grief, but with recognition. After years of living inside other people's silence, I was finally hearing the sound of my own breath. I looked at the 2 cups. Steam rose, met halfway, and disappeared. Like 2 lives crossing once more in the quiet. The room was still. The clock ticked steadily, familiar as a heartbeat. I didn't know how Daniel would respond or what would come tomorrow, but I knew one thing. I was no longer afraid of any wind that came knocking. I took a sip of my tea, bitter first, then sweet. On the windowsill, the cracked seashell caught the faintest glimmer of light. It sat there, listening with me. Noonlight slanted through the curtains, slow and warm. I was wiping the table when a knock sounded at the door. 3 firm raps, then 1 small, hesitant tap. It was so familiar my heart tightened. I opened the door. Leo and Chloe stood there. Before I could speak, they ran in and wrapped their arms around me. They were taller than the last time I'd seen them. Sun-browned hair, the smell of soap and summer grass clinging to their clothes. Leo hugged me hard. Chloe buried her face into my shoulder, her small voice barely more than a whisper of wind. "Grandma, we missed you." I bent down and held them both, their small bodies pressed against my chest, and for a moment I wanted to cry but didn't dare. The scent of childhood, candy, earth, sunlight, filled the room. Then laughter burst out of me, short and sharp, like a sound that had been trapped for years, finally finding its way home. When the 3 of us sat on the sofa, Chloe opened her little satchel and pulled something out. Her voice bubbled with pride. "Dad said to give this back to you." The cracked seashell lay in their hands, the same fracture still there, only cleaner now, gleaming faintly from having been dusted free of sand. I reached out and touched it, my fingertip tracing the familiar line, cool, smooth, like a scar that had long since healed. I smiled, softly, evenly. "You keep it," I said. "It sings best when there's wind." They looked at each other, then back at me, eyes wide, asking silently, "Does it really sing?" I nodded. "When you hold it to your ear, you'll hear the ocean, but only if you truly listen." Leo pressed it to his ear right away, head tilted, eyes squinting. He stayed still for a few seconds, then giggled. "I hear it! It's saying something." Chloe snatched it gently, listened, and said with utter seriousness, "It's saying, 'Don't forget to smile.'" I laughed, a real unguarded laugh. The sound filled the apartment, and for the first time, the place seemed brighter. Not because of sunlight, but because laughter had come back. Chloe ran to the window, pointing to a cluster of birds cutting through the sky. "Grandma, where's the ocean?" I pointed toward the line of light where the horizon met the sky. "Right there, sweetheart. The sea isn't just in the water, it's inside us, too." They nodded, as if they understood more than words could hold. Leo set the seashell gently on the table,
careful, as if placing down a treasure. I looked at them, my heart softening like a wave meeting the sand. Maybe this was the sound I had been waiting for, the sound of laughter returning. After cookies and milk, Leo and Chloe discovered the box of pastels on my easel. I started to stop them, then let it be. A room should have the touch of children at least once. They sat, cross-legged on the floor, paper spread wide, heads tilted close together like two sparrows sharing a secret song. They drew the sea in oil pastels, their hands smeared with color, their mouths full of cookie crumbs. Leo picked a deep blue. Chloe added streaks of yellow where the sun met the water. "This is where you stand," she said, drawing a small figure near the edge of the waves. I asked, smiling, "And what am I doing there?" "You're listening to the sea tell stories," she answered without looking up. I laughed softly. The scent of wax mingled with sugar, the perfume of childhood filling the whole room. A neighbor's cat leapt onto the windowsill and curled up as if this place had never lacked the sound of people. I sat back and watched them. The afternoon light caught their hair, shining like grains of sea salt. The small apartment suddenly felt bigger, as though another window had opened, one that looked out onto memory. In that moment, I understood what I'd once forgotten. I remember being loved, not being used. Love, when it's real, doesn't ask for proof, not in deeds or signatures or deeds of ownership. It just lives quietly in children's laughter, in silences that don't make anyone afraid. I stood and fetched a wet cloth to wipe their hands. Blue pastel stained their skin, and mine too, spreading across my wrist like water. Chloe looked up and giggled. "Grandma, the ocean kissed you!" I laughed again, the kind of laugh that leaves no weight behind, light as breath. By the time the sky began to dim, my phone buzzed. I looked down. A message from Daniel. "Mom, I'll come by later to pick up the kids. Can we talk?" I read it twice. Short. No excuses, no sharpness. Just a pause, an ellipsis between two thoughts. Like someone taking a breath, unsure but trying. Outside, the sunset washed the wall in amber, touching the sea within painting. The waves inside it seemed to stir. The curtain moved with the breeze, carrying a hint of salt and the soft scent of crayons and cookies. I set the phone down on the table, didn't answer. Not yet. I just smiled. From across the room, Chloe laughed loud and bright, and Leo called out, "Grandma, look! The sun's painting too." I said, "Yes, and it paints with light." My voice was calm, steady, as if no one was about to knock on the door. But the truth was, I was ready to open it. The afternoon was soft and golden. Light stretched across the wooden floor, casting long shadows of two people sitting across from each other. Daniel sat for a long time, eyes on the floor, his breathing heavy. Neither of us spoke. The clock ticked steadily. Outside, the hum of traffic faded, leaving only the sound of his breath breaking the quiet between us. 2 cups of tea sat on the table. The steam had already gone. I poured again, and the thin trail of vapor rose, drawing a fragile line between us, a boundary between 2 generations that had lost their rhythm. Daniel pressed his hand to his forehead. His voice came low and rough. "Mom, I thought you needed me, but it turns out I needed your respect, and I didn't give you mine." I looked at my son, the man who once believed strength meant being in control, now trembling because of one honest sentence. His shoulders quivered, not from crying, but from holding back the flood. And in his eyes I saw the same boy who once feared breaking my teacup, the same fear now, but for my heart. I set my cup down, folded my hands, and waited until he lifted his head. Then I spoke, my tone light and even, as if I were simply talking about the weather. You haven't lost your mother. You've just lost the right to organize her. A small smile found its way to my lips, not to comfort him, but to let him know forgiveness had arrived long before the apology. Daniel let out a shaky laugh, part relief, part sorrow. He shook his head, his voice catching. I guess I never realized how much control sounds like love until I lost it. I didn't answer, just nodded, because sometimes love really does sound like its opposite. Outside the window, the breeze tugged gently at the curtain. Light spilled across the floor, a honey-colored warmth that felt kinder than any winter I'd ever lived through. Daniel bowed his head again. A tear fell. One single drop, absorbed into the wood grain as if it had always belonged there. He nodded once, then again, deeper, a silent, I understand. And for a moment, the distance between the man of 30-something and the small boy afraid of the dark simply dissolved. He looked, again, like the child who used to hide behind my legs. The small shape I once protected now returned inside the man who'd thought himself strong enough to protect everyone else. I reached out, my fingers sliding gently through his thick hair. You don't have to keep apologizing, I said. Everyone takes the wrong road sometimes. You just have to know when to stop. He drew in a deep breath, gripped the edge of the table, and let out a faint laugh. I just wish I'd realized sooner. I shook my head. Sometimes sooner or later doesn't matter. What matters is that you turned back. Silence settled between us again, light as breath. I looked at my cup. The last curl of steam had faded. A line came to mind, that forgiveness isn't a signature. It's the act of setting something heavy down. I smiled to myself. Forgiveness isn't signing a paper. It's dropping a pebble you've carried too long. It doesn't make a sound, but suddenly your shoulders are lighter. I stood. Daniel rose too, awkward, unsure what to do with his shaking hands. I opened my arms. He stepped in. We hugged, not tightly, just enough for me to hear his heartbeat mingling with the faint wind from the hallway. It was steady, low, real. Neither of us said a word. Outside, the sunset slid down the wall, painting the room a quiet amber. No more tears, just warmth. The kind we had both wandered too far to find, now here again, still and full. I closed my eyes, letting my heart say what words could never reach. You came home, and I'm still here. Late afternoon. The Oregon coast stretched out like a sheet of red silk. The sun sank low, sweeping its light across the water, brilliant yet tender like the day's final breath. I walked with my granddaughter along the sand. Chloe's small hand rested inside mine, warm and slightly damp. The waves brushed our ankles, cold enough to sting, but reminding me I was still alive. Behind us, Leo darted around with a driftwood stick, tracing circles in the sand that led nowhere. Chloe stopped every few steps, bending down, searching carefully between the surf and the shore. The sky glowed the color of an old scarf I used to wear every winter, warm, faded, never less beautiful for its age. Then Chloe's voice rose, bright and proud. "Grandma, look! This one isn't cracked!" She held up a perfect shell, small and smooth, its curves unbroken. A piece of the sea untouched by storm. The sunset caught it, casting a flicker of trembling light across her face. I knelt, brushed sand from her knees, and said softly, "Keep it, to remember that even cracks can heal." She tilted her head. "Why remember cracks, Grandma?" I smiled. "Because when you grow up, you'll see. The most beautiful things aren't the ones that never broke, but the ones that knew how to mend." The wind tossed her hair, and the scent of salt and sand mixed with the faint sweetness of cookies from my coat pocket. Farther down the shore, Leo ran along the waterline, calling something I couldn't make out, his small head bobbing against the fiery light. The beach was almost empty now. A few couples walked in the distance, their footprints erased one by the tide. Time, I thought, works the same way, wiping clean what once was to make room for what can be. Chloe cupped the shell to her ear. "It's still singing, Grandma." I smiled. "Yes, but this time, listen just for you." She nodded, solemnly, so earnest it almost broke my heart. I looked toward the horizon, where the sun melted into the water, its light spilling forward like a road without end. The breeze brushed my shoulder, soft and salty, the same texture as my husband's hands, long ago. I squeezed her hand, 2 hands, one old, one young, holding the same small piece of sea, walking together through a distance that knew how to breathe. Chloe ran ahead, her tiny footprints beside mine. Leo followed, drawing gentle waves into the sand with his stick. I stopped and watched them, 2 small echoes of the bloodline that had once broken me, now the reason I could stand tall again. The sea murmured around us, steady and deep, as if counting every year I had survived. And I realized, through all of this, there were no winners or losers. I hadn't conquered anyone. I had simply reclaimed my own breath. Every struggle, every wound, every plea to be understood had led me back to one quiet truth: to be myself, without fear. The wind from the water rolled in, cool and damp, carrying the scent of kelp and life. I inhaled deeply, feeling my lungs fill with air, my heart with peace. Every cell remembered the rhythm of living I'd lost for too long. The sun dipped, its light touching the water, the waves beating a pulse, the heartbeat of a life freely chosen. No one arranging it, no one signing for it, no one deciding on my behalf. Just me, nearly 70, sitting by the sea, knowing that every breath I took was mine. Chloe rested her head on my shoulder, her smile warm as dusk. Leo gathered shells, stuffing them into his pocket, promising to make a wind chime. I let him. No warnings, no fear of breaking. Some things, when they fall, don't need to be picked up, only understood. I looked out, the sun now kissing the horizon, its last thread of gold stitching the day closed. The waves rolled in, the sound of the sea blended with my heartbeat, a quiet, even rhythm. I closed my eyes, feeling the wind move through my hair, as if time itself had paused to breathe with me. Then, softly, like an exhale at the edge of twilight, came the final thought. Sometimes love needs distance to breathe. I smiled. No bitterness, no regret, only light, glimmering across the horizon where a woman once broken had finally learned how to stand, to inhale, and to live with a heart unafraid of the wind. I used to think happiness meant keeping everything unbroken. Now I know, sometimes happiness is having the courage to look at a crack and still see something beautiful. Like my teacup, it's been broken, yet I still drink from it, because every fracture is a thread of life itself. If you've ever had a day when you had to let go, to leave a place you once called home, or walk out a door while your heart was still wet with goodbye, tell me your story down in the comments. I want to hear it, because maybe among all our scattered pieces, we'll find something whole again. And if these stories have brought you even a little peace, subscribe, so the next time I speak, we can meet once more in the quiet space we share.